Rohit, let's begin.
Yep, let's begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another Anand Teltumbde's distinguished lecture series. Today's session is going to be on global inequality and redistribution. My name is Rohit, and we're thrilled to have such a fantastic turnaround for today's discussion. A big thank you to you all for joining us as we dive into the important issues of global inequality and redistribution. Now, having said that, let me quickly run through the format. I think Suraj briefly touched through it. So we'll have the introduction by Suraj for around like 5 minutes, and then we'll have our distinguished guest Thomas speak for around like 30 minutes, and which will be followed by Q&A for 20 minutes, and then we'll like round up. And thanks. So we'll begin with a brief introduction from Suraj Jengde, who will introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Thomas Piketty. Um, Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Suraj, who will be moderating today's event as well. So, Suraj, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Thomas Piketty, for coming and hoping, and I hope the conversation will take us in many directions. Today's lecture is we are honoring Anand Teltumbde. One of the ideas that I had was to honor people while they're alive, and constitute something that could kind of continue some of the ideas that they pan out. Anand Teltumbde, who also you have cited in your work concerning the caste system and Dalits, and I thought it was befitting for us to have you come and talk and educate us about this. For those many of us who know, Thomas Piketty was, I mean, many of us know as an economist was written on capital inequality, but he was also written on climate change and so forth. The two books that were the first time I was introduced to Thomas Piketty was in Syracuse 2015 by the mayor of Syracuse City, who had hosted me and my friend over Thanksgiving dinner, and he had already read the hefty book, and he was discussing. Actually, he was the husband of the mayor, and he discussed extensively about this book, and that made me very curious, especially, of course, capital, and some of us who studied social sciences were very much aware of the Marxian literature. So I was very much enthusiastic to come to that literature through that angle. But what I was more interested after that book was about capital and ideology, where Thomas really takes us through the ideological parentheses that we see, and one of the ways that he does, I think, very effectively, and which is to credit to the French writing tradition, was to look at not just the European inequality, but also extend it through ancient regime and look at India. And so though we see the ternary, especially the French ancient regime, and the Indian Brahminical class. And in his own research, very much fundamentally puts into place that the ruling class, when the colonization came in, condemned a form of domination, but at the same time upholded the domination that they were part of. And those are the complexities that very few people, especially in the economic field, will talk about. But he has statistics, he has data, he has many charts that we can go through, and we can educate ourselves. And then, of course, there's a book, A Time for Socialism, collection of his essays in Lamont, though the text really, and as he also himself says in the book, that he would not have probably written about this when he was growing up, I mean, in college in the 1990s, but now it was about time. And there are various factors that confine us to thinking about the ideological heavy divides. And in Capital Ideology, I think is the text that keeps coming and coming again and again, was about the kind of a global Brahmin class that he talks about, the Brahmin left. And I think this is a very interesting chapter, the 15th chapter, and looks at the what he calls the cleavages. And I think it is something that we need to loosen our understanding to understand what Brahmin as a class, as a contemporary understanding of society means. We have Boston Brahmins here, which of course elevates the beyond color racial paradigms. In A Brief History of Inequality, what fascinated me more was about his interesting take on India's reservation system. And he has written emphatically about how India's reservations, especially the constitutional mandates, have been at a surpassing level where no other countries have managed to reach to that level of reaching these racial social quotas. Of course, he talks about gender disparity being one of the quotas, which is acceptable. But when we talk about racial color, ethnic, social-based identity quota, we get difficulties. In the Indian, of course, regime, we had two incidences, 1950 Indian Constitution, 1993 Mandal Commission, which he looks at the data and tells us how these growing disparities are working in or against the favor. And I think it is telling that uh, even though these are good regimes, and he talks about this new idea of having an universal endowment starting at the age of 25. And I think this is a very radical principle. Also, to look at how various wealth measures and taxation is being redistributed in our current times. Now, we have this idea, and Thomas Piketty says, and I quote him, no Western country has ever implemented social or racial quotas in a way comparable to what has been done in India. Now, when we look at that, we are also looking at what social parity, what it will take for the disadvantaged classes to reach social parity. And for that, we need to look at much more complicated ways, especially the Indian elites, in his own understanding, were happy to have a certain quotas, but not distribute the values, the actual properties, the reproduction of what class and as well as ideological permutations work. So quota in a way, and Anand Teltumbde also is somebody who has been on that same position to think about not just having a piecemeal redistribution of resources and a piecemeal granting of resources, but redistribution that remains. And agrarian redistribution remains one of that. And Dr. Ambedkar here becomes important because for Ambedkar, many people credit him for the quota system, which happens in 1932 through the Pune Pact between Gandhi and Ambedkar. But Ambedkar is somebody who is very much advocating for a radical socialism in the sense of redistribution. And he's also somebody who is not your traditional radical leftist, the Stalinist or Leninist. Ambedkar is somebody who is also happy to have debentures. He's happy to repay the landowners for the state to take over the land and redistribute among masses. So Ambedkar's idea of having separate electorates and also separate villages, separate spaces for the Dalits so that they can have their own economy and they can be on par with others was something very radical. And he wrote that as a constitution from his own self. The Indian Constitution is not Ambedkar's sole authorship, but state and minorities is Ambedkar's sole authorship of Indian Constitution, which is obviously disowned by the bourgeois class, especially the Bombay elites of India. In that light, we are now looking at it, and as Thomas Piketty one more says, and I quote him, now this has been a very great achievement when it comes to concerning modern quotas. Then he says, should we then noisily congratulate ourselves for setting up a few meager compensatory systems that ameliorate only a small part of the systemic inequality that we refuse to challenge? And that's the challenge of world over complexities that we are facing. So in this light, I'm very honored, and we are all honored, over a ton of us here, Thomas Piketty, to hear your views, and then we'll take questions after your talk. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Suraj, for this introduction. So let me, maybe if you allow me to share the screen, I will maybe show a few slides, but this, yeah, I think you have to allow me to share slides for me to do that. Yeah, it seems to be deactivated. I don't know if you can, oh yes, thank you. I will, okay, so if, I assume this, is this okay for you? Can you see my slides? Yeah, okay, that's good. So, this is the very general title I gave for this lecture, global inequality and redistribution, a comparative and historical perspective. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk mostly, about my book, A Brief History of Equality, and I will also show a few findings from the World Inequality Report 2022, and more generally from the World Inequality Database, which is a sort of very collective research program involving more than 200 researchers from all over the world, where we try to give some global perspective on inequality and raise basically democratic transparency about money, trying to put pressures on governments so as to release more information on income and wealth, who earns what, and especially who owns what. And we've made some progress in this direction, and I want to share with you some of our findings, and then I will of course return to the more political aspects on how do we transform the distribution of income and wealth in a country. So let me start right away, with a world map, which is sort of a summary of the structure of global inequality today. So here we start with the inequality of income, then we will move to the inequality of wealth, of ownership. So looking at inequality of income, here I start with a very simple indicator, which is the share of total income going to the top 10% of the population. So just to get the orders of magnitude right, you are 10% of the population. If you had complete equality, you should have 10% of total income. If you had complete inequality, you should have 100% of total income. So in the real world, it's always in between, of course, 10 and 100. Now it goes from 20, 25% to 70%. So the most equal country will be Nordic Europe. You would have 20, 25% of total income for the top 10. The most unequal country in our database right now is South Africa, where it will be close to 70%. And India, will be a little bit not too far ahead, around 60% of total income for the top 10. Brazil will be in this region as well. Generally speaking, there's a couple of lessons from this simple world map. First lesson, you have enormous variation in levels of inequality across the world. So, it doesn't go from 10 to 100%, but it goes from 20 to 70. So it's really enormous variation. Second observation, in fact, if we go back through history, and I will show you a few historical graphs later on, it has changed a lot over time. So today, if we look at the situation today, you can see that the global north, and in particular Europe, tends to be more equal than the south, generally speaking. And even the US or Japan, which are more unequal than Europe, look more equal than South Africa, Brazil, India, or Saudi Arabia, or Mexico, etc. So, global North looks relatively more equal as compared to global South. Now, this has not always been like that. So that's an interesting thing, is that if you go back 100 years ago, you look at Europe before World War I, and you look at this same indicator, top 10% income share, it was not South Africa, but it was close to Latin America, close to Brazil. So it would be 50, 60% of total income for the top 10 rather than 25, 30%. So, this has not always been like that. And how did Europe in particular become more equal over the course of the 20th century? Well, this did not happen easily. This happened through enormous social struggle, political mobilization, also enormous political shocks, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the pressure put by the Bolshevik Revolution from the East, and in the end, a complete transformation of the social fiscal system, the rise of the welfare state, social state, the rise of progressive taxation, and I will return a little bit on that. But the main message here is that it's really been, the political mobilization and the rise of sort of relatively universal redistributive policies, which, despite their many limitations, because this is not the end of the story, and we still live, including in Europe, in very unequal and stratified societies, but the progress that has been made has come through universal policies of granting more access to general public services, education, health, redistributive taxation. And, going back to your introduction, Suraj, about India and quota, I think one of the message I am pushing in my research is that, okay, quota can be useful, in certain contexts with enormous, historical discrimination and historical prejudice against certain groups. So, we should not be afraid, of course, of pushing for quota. But quota will never be alone, will never be enough. And what has been lacking typically in a country like India since independence, in my view, is that, for part of the elite, quota have been sometime a way to sort of give you a good self-conscience about the situation, the feeling that you do something to help a formerly discriminated group without paying the tax that you will need to pay to provide high quality public services for everybody, without of course redistributing the land or redistributing the wealth. And at the end of the day, if you really want to reduce inequality, you have to attack this. And I'm not saying that's easy. It's clear that in the case of Europe in particular, the elite was severely weakened by World War One, World War Two, the Great Depression. And so these were very particular conditions in a way after World War Two, which produced this possibility for the labor movement, broadly speaking, and complex set of socialist parties, communist parties, social democratic party, labor party to take power in Europe and in effect transform the institutional setup. It's not easy. It's not a simple political process, but in the end, this is what has worked not only to bring more equality, but I will argue also to bring more prosperity. And when I hear people in sometime in India or Brazil or in the global south say, okay, we'll first need to get rich, and when we will be as rich as you, we will think about reducing inequality. This is not the way it happened in the north. In fact, the process of reduction of inequality went really hand in hand with the process of increased prosperity. So that's, the general message from which I would like to start. Now, this is one indicator about the top 10% share. You can look at other indicators, in a way, the reverse indicator, which is the bottom 50% share, is even more interesting. So again, just a few words about the orders of magnitude. You are 50% of the population. If you had complete equality, you should have 50% of total income. If you had complete inequality, you should have 0%. So of course, in practice, you're always between 0 and 50. You can go from 5 to 30. So again, 5% would be in South Africa. So now if you are 50% of the population and you have only 5% of total income, it means that individually, on average, your income is only 1/10 of the average income of the country in which you live. So, it means you're really very far from the average. So, the gaps in this society are absolutely enormous. If you have 25-30% of total income, like in Nordic Europe, it means the average income of the bottom 50%, is about half of average income of the country as a whole. So, okay, you are poorer than average, after all, you are the bottom 50%, but you're not hugely poorer than average. So again, the lesson from this is that distribution matters enormously. And people who say, okay, we only care about, growth and GDP per capita and average income are completely wrong on this, because you can see with this data that, for same, the share of total income going to the bottom 50% is going to vary by a factor of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, which means really that for a similar per capita GDP or per capita national income, the average income of the bottom 50% can vary by a factor of 1 to 5, 1 to 6, which in terms of basic poverty and access to basic goods and food and clothing and housing and everything we care about, the distribution of income is going to make an enormous difference. So that's for income. Now, if we look at the distribution of wealth, the concentration of capital ownership, that's even more extreme. So here, basically, the norm is so that's a figure from World Inequality Report 22, and you will get more detailed data country by country on the World Inequality Database website. But here, the bottom line is that concentration of capital, concentration of wealth is even more extreme than income inequality. And even in Europe, it is a bit more equal than in the rest of the world, but still, if you look at the bottom 50% in Europe, they own 5 or 6% of total wealth. Okay, so that's better than in Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's going to be 1% or 2%, but it's very small, even in Europe. The difference in Europe, as we will see, is that what I call here the patrimonial middle class, sort of middle 40% who are in between the bottom 50 and the top 10. So they're not really the middle, they are actually over the middle, they are in between the bottom 50% and top 10%. They have gained a bigger share of the pie in Europe over time. So there's been some change, but there's been limited change over time. We also cover other indicators in the World Inequality Database. One very interesting, I think, indicator for gender inequality is simply this, which is the share of women in total labor income, and which, of course, this is putting together the fact that you are paid less as a woman for a given occupation, but this also includes the fact that you don't have access to the same occupation. So this is putting everything together, and I think this gives a view of gender inequality, which is in a way more meaningful and also more extreme than when we think for a given occupation, where we look at the wage premium for men for a given occupation. So here you can see that even in North America or Western Europe, where there's been some progress in the women's share, the women's share is still 35, 36, 37%, which means that men are getting 62, 63%. So it's still very large inequality. Even higher, of course, in South Asia, in Middle East, North Africa. In China, women's share has actually been declining in recent decades, which is quite interesting. So we're still very, very far from 50% pretty much everywhere. Post-communist countries do a little better than other countries, but in China, you have this deterioration in recent decades. And the final indicator of global inequality I want to mention before moving to the more historical perspective is inequality in per capita emissions, which I think is quite interesting because when we talk about the distribution of carbon emission across the world, we usually stress inequality between the global north and global south, and that's perfectly justified. As we know, the global north has enormous historical responsibilities in carbon emission, and the countries that are going to suffer the most are typically India, Sub-Saharan Africa, who have a very small share in historical emission. But we should not forget that you also have enormous inequality within the north, within the south, in terms of emission. So if you look at the case of Europe, the bottom 50% in Europe in terms of emission, right now they have 5.1 tons per capita. That's including the carbon content of imports. So this is higher than if we forget about imports. So 5.1 is too high. This should go toward 4, 3, 2 in the coming decades, but it's not completely out of line with the objective, climate objective. The problem is that you have some people at the top, who have emissions of 20, 30, 50, 100, if you look at the top 1%. And the bottom line here is that there's no way you can address the climate crisis if you don't reduce inequality enormously, because there's no way you're going to make people at the bottom change their lifestyle and consumption pattern if you don't start by reducing drastically the living standards and carbon content of people at the top. So the idea is that you can address climate change with a proportional carbon tax, reducing everybody in proportion to their emission, is really an illusion, and is not going to work. Now, moving to the sort of historical lessons. So what I'm going to say in the last part of this talk comes a lot from my brief history of equality, which I strongly recommend you. That's a relatively short book, 200 or 250 pages or so, much shorter than these 3 books, which are 1,000 pages each, and which you really need to have time to get into them. And so if you have less time, this book is much shorter, 250 pages. And I think it's clearer in a way because I try to summarize what I consider to be some of the main lessons from my previous research. And what I stress in this book is also the more optimistic and positive dimension. I stress the fact that over time, there's been a movement toward more equality. So if you take a country like France, that's what I mentioned before, in France or in Europe more generally, in the 19th century, inequality of income was much larger than what it is today. It was closer to Latin America today, if you want. And over the course of the 20th century, so starting after World War One and accelerating during the interwar period, and especially after World War II, you've had a substantial reduction of inequality. This did not happen just like this. It took enormous social struggle, political mobilization. Now, for wealth inequality, there's been a similar movement, but much more limited. So this is what I was referring to earlier. The bottom 50% is still basically does not own much. Now, this patrimonial middle class in the middle now actually is more different today from the bottom 50% than what it was in the 19th century, which is good in some ways, but which also, I think, contribute to some of the political difficulties that we see in the sense that it's maybe easier to sort of unite the bottom 50% and the middle 40% today than what it was 100 years ago, because people in the middle 40% are people, who are not very rich. So think a little bit about the numbers. You average in rich countries today, in France or in the US, net wealth per capita is going to be maybe 200,000 euros or 250,000 euros per individual. So these are, if you are 40% of the population and you own about 40% of total wealth, it means on average you have about the average wealth, so say 200,000 euros per capita. So we are talking of a social groups who own anywhere between 100, 200, 300, 400,000 euros. So these are people who are not very rich, they're not millionaires or billionaires, but they are not completely poor. Typically, they own their home or they own a small business, and they don't like to be treated like poor, and they don't want to fall back to the bottom 50% who don't own anything. And politically, the alliance between this sort of patrimonial middle class and the bottom 50% is more complicated in a way than in the early 20th century where the bottom 90% did not own anything. So, there are positive aspects to this transformation of the wealth distribution, but this also, I think, contributes to create political complications together with large territorial division, between large cities where it's more difficult to access property, but easier to access higher education, and more rural areas, small cities where it's the opposite. So all of this also contributes to some of the difficulties in forming political coalition and continuing the movement toward more equality today. In any case, if we try to have a sort of very big, broad picture on what was successful in the past to bring more equality and what could be successful in the future, you have this issue of political coalition I just mentioned. What we should remember also is that in the past, what has worked, if we look at the reduction of inequality in the 20th century in countries where we had large reduction of inequality, the rise of the social state, broadly speaking, was the number one factor. So, 100 years ago, before World War One, tax revenue were less than 10% of national income everywhere, in particular in Europe. Most of this was used to pay for the army, for the police, for the justice, for a sort of Hegelian state, also for colonial expansion. There was very little social spending in terms of education or else. Education spending before World War One was less than 1% of national income and usually less than 0.5% of national income everywhere in the West, with a very elitist and stratified educational system. Today, it's like 5-6% of national income, and this broader access to education has contributed a lot, not only to more equality, but also to more prosperity. This has happened together with very progressive tax system. So let me just remind you that, in a country like the United States, the top income tax rate has been sometime over 90% under Roosevelt. And, on average, between 1930 and 1980, it has been 81%. And, this is only the federal top income tax rate. If you add a state income tax rate of New York, Massachusetts, California, which can be 5 to 10%, it's even bigger. Apparently, this did not destroy US capitalism. Otherwise, we would have noticed it. And, if anything, this was the period of highest economic growth, including productivity growth in the US. The country was dominating the rest of the world in the middle of the 20th century in terms of productivity in a way which we had never seen before that or since that, simply because, the key behind prosperity is not so much to have extreme inequality, but rather to have a relatively more inclusive access to education. And in the US, in the middle of the 20th century, in spite of enormous inequality, in particular racial inequality, discrimination, there was indeed a very substantial educational advance as compared to other countries of the time. So like in the 1950s, you have 90% of a generation going to high school in the US, whereas in Western Europe, in Germany, in France, or in Japan, at the same time, it's 20-30%. And you need to wait until the 1980s, 1990s to go to universal access to high school in Western Europe and Japan, and also to see a productivity convergence with the US. So, that's very important to remember, because we come today at a time after so look at what happened during the 80s. This is the Reagan destruction of progressive taxation, where the story that Reagan told the US in the 1980s was, okay, we are going to demolish progressive taxation, we're going to divide the top tax rate by 2 or 3. Maybe inequality is going to rise, but productivity growth, innovation is going to be so fantastic that the size of the pie is going to grow so fast that everybody in the end is going to benefit, and average income, average wealth is going to grow like you've never seen. Except that, in fact, the growth rate, so top tax rate, in red was divided by 2, but the growth rate actually was also divided by 2 instead of going up. So, you can see, in green, you have the annual growth rate of per capita national income in the US. And since Reagan, for the 1990-2020 period or until today, it has been, a little over 1% as compared to over 2% in previous historical periods. And by the way, I'm not saying that the growth rate was divided by 2 because the top income tax rate was divided by 2. I think it's mostly the stagnation of productivity growth has more to do with the stagnation of educational investment, in my view. But in any case, what this shows is that, in itself, cutting progressive taxation and having more inequality is certainly not a recipe to have more economic prosperity. And I think this disappointment and, this failure of the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s is also another important explanation for some of the political complications, to say the least, that we observe today. So in particular, in the US, the Republican Party has become increasingly nationalist, to say the least, partly because of the failure of the promise made by Reagan, who said, your income is going to rise like you've never seen. People have not seen that in their income, in their wages. So now Donald Trump, but it could be someone else on the Republican Party, is basically telling the voters, you've been stolen by the rest of the world, the Mexican workers, China, Muslim, Europeans, the rest of the world has stolen the hard work of hardworking white Americans, and because they need an explanation for why the neoliberal policy did not work. And so this the sort of neo-nationalism that we see today, to me, is the direct consequence of the failure of liberalism. So now, what do we do? Well, I think we have to pursue the movement toward social democracy, or I prefer to talk about democratic socialism to make it more ambitious. And for this, you mentioned it, Suraj, we have to redistribute wealth itself. So I think it's not enough. It's good to have basic income. I'm all for it, and it actually already exists in many European countries. It's good to have public services in education and health, and we need to put more resources into these services. But in addition to this, we need to redistribute wealth and inheritance. This should not be, instead of basic income or instead of the welfare state. This should really come in addition to this. And I would not recommend to do this in a country where you don't have basic income, you don't have public education and health. I think we have to do things step by step. But once you have, kind of European welfare state we have, I think this next step is typically what we should aim for the 21st century. So here, in this graph, I'm just making a very simple simulation where everybody at age 25 is receiving 60% of average inheritance. So in the context of Western Europe, this will be, average inheritance will be 200,000 euros. So it will be 120,000 euros. And this is not, we are still very far from complete equality. If you take the top 10% in Europe today, they receive 1 million euro on average. After this system, so this is paid for by progressive taxation of inheritance and progressive taxation of wealth. So like people who today receive 1 million, they will still have 600,000 euros left. So as compared to those who would receive 120,000 euros at the bottom, there's still a lot of inequality. So, to summarize, people at the bottom go from 0 to 120, and people at the top 10% go from 1 million to 600. If you want my opinion, we could go a lot further in this direction. But what's interesting is that when you make this kind of proposal, many people get mad at this, including many people who pretend to be in favor of equality of opportunity, etc. But when you say that, they start saying, oh, but these poor children, they are going to do all sorts of stupid things with the money if you give them money, as if rich children were always doing intelligent things with the money they receive. So you realize that people have really double standards about equal opportunity. Let me conclude by saying that apart from redistribution of wealth, probably the most important issue is more equal access to education. And here also, there's a lot of hypocrisy. We pretend to be, to follow principles of equal opportunity. But in practice, this is the kind of reality we have. If we look in the US today and you rank students by percentile of parental income, and you look at the rate of access to university, this is what you get. This is research from my colleagues Emmanuel Saez and Raj Shetty, and it's quite impressive. It's almost a straight line, and it goes almost from 0 to 100%. So not quite. When your parents are very poor, you still have a 25% chance to go to university, and when your parents are very rich, you only have a 95% chance to go to university. So okay, it doesn't go from 0 to 100, it goes from 25 to 95, but it's still quite extreme. And it's in fact it's even worse, because in practice you don't go to the same university when you're at the top, at the bottom. So we pretend to be in favor of equal opportunity, etc. But in practice, we have, there's been a lot of educational advance. At least now people go to high school, university. 100 years ago, everybody was stuck in primary school except the very elite. But, there's still a long way to go. This is true in a country like the US with very high tuition fees. But this is also true in a country like France with a mostly public education system, but with very elitist schools who are getting a lot more public money than the bottom school. So on this graph, there's another way to represent educational inequality where, I compute how much public resources different children are getting. And the bottom line here is that people at the top who go to very elitist public school in France are getting a lot more public funding than people in the middle who go to regular public universities with less funding than the elitist public top schools. And people at the bottom are people who actually don't go to higher education at all, and they are getting even less public resources. And so, in effect, these public investments are reinforcing initial family inequality. That being said, and this will be my last slide, there's been some progress historically, and here I am comparing the concentration of educational investment between France today, France 100 years ago, and Algeria 1950, which is sort of the typical example and one of the most extreme example of a colonial society with extreme inequality. So the way it would work in Algeria in 1950, in French Algeria, was that the top 10% will be the children of the colonizers, the settlers, French children. They will be in separate schools, a little bit like south of the United States before the 1960s, but except that in my country, in France, when we talk about racial segregation and the legacy of the U.S. South segregation in the U.S., people in France tend to say, oh, but we have nothing to do with this. There's no racial segregation in France. This does not exist. Well, except that it's the French colonial empire, so across the Mediterranean in Algeria, you had separate schools for the children of the French settlers and children of the Muslim population, Algerian population. And if you look at the budget, the education budget, and this is what we've done to construct this graph, in fact, you see that the school for the white children, French children, were getting, like 80% of the budget. They were 10% of the population, but they were getting 80% of the budget. We've not done the same computation for US South before 1960s, but I think it's probably even more extreme in French Algeria in colonial societies than what it was in the US South. I mean, you had also complete segregation, of course, in the US South, but I don't think the budget between the different schools were as unequal as what they were in French Algeria. So anyway, as compared to this situation, even France 1910 looks very equal, and France 2020 looks incredibly equal. Except that, in fact, France 2020 is the same graph as what we have here. This is a situation where the top 10% of children, they're getting only 20% of the resources, whereas the bottom 50% are getting almost 35%. But the bottom 50% of children, they are 5 times more numerous than the top 10%. So in fact, they should get, if you wanted to have equal resources for each group, the top 10% should have 10% and the bottom 50%, 50%. So in fact, the France 2020 is a very unequal system. So this is just saying that if we put the history of equality and inequality into perspective, into this long-run perspective, looking at, capitalist societies 100 years ago, colonial societies in the middle of the 20th century, the bottom line is that, we've made progress, but there's still a lot of progress to be made, and this will take more political battles, more social struggle, more political mobilization before we get to true effective equality. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'd be very happy to discuss further and answer questions.
Thank you so very much. If we were in person, we would have clapped out loud. I think you cover this kind of a history, especially looking at the tripartite kind of alliance that exists, the clergy, the nobility, and so forth, and of course there is a serving class that is in France, of course, and then we see those kind of alliances work. You also talk about the proprietarian class, or the new proprietarian class, with its own meritocratic narrative. It has maintained its status quo. And then, of course, your educational graph kind of hit close to that point. But also your point about the more economic prosperity will come, the kind of refusal for people to, in the neo-colonial narrative, that there has to be more economic prosperity, so we need to kind of embolden businesses and the historical kind of inherited class. But that doesn't guarantee economic prosperity. So the question remains. I mean, it has been historical trajectory, and if you look at colonialism and so forth, I mean that trajectory is not that long. The way we attribute inequality in the sense of course, the graph is not lengthier, right? I mean, in India, officially, if you look at colonialism, is approximately 90 plus years, especially since the proclamation. Of course, we had the East India Company and so forth, but then we have to understand that, I mean, that narrative itself is so twisted in the sense that the local mercantile class was always in cahoots with expansion of capital. And the nationalistic ethos says that, we have always had this heavy mercantile trade. It was used through seas, and seafarers were there. We owned. So this kind of medieval era, mid 18th to 19th century narrative exists. So we see a very complex picture, especially the graph that you are talking about. Could you maybe just help us think about what will it take for not a magic wand, but for because in your book, Ideology and Capital Ideology, you talk about it being a political system as well that is governing inequality, and you very emphatically argue. There is another the larger question of there are interpersonal forces, the classic Marxian dogma about modes of production kind of filling into it. And then the data that you bring us to kind of challenge that in a way. So if today there is this new proprietarian class, I think that's a very strong catchphrase that could work in many societies, cutting across the non-economic divisive factors that are often social. Could you maybe build a little bit, help us, especially the youth who want to go and protest against Israel for whatever, in support of Palestine and so forth. If they want to know more about it, they want to look about colonization. Would neo-proprietarian class as a meritocratic upholder of a certain economic incentives help in understanding some of the issues that we are talking today?
Yes, that's a very difficult and important question. Let me simply say that, dominant classes have always had a lot of imagination, to justify their position and to construct, narratives and ideologies to try to perpetuate their position. And I think, the only possible response is that the rest of us, need to have a superior imagination, to imagine another world, another set of institutions. And let me stress that historically, the labor movement, broadly speaking, has been very successful to transform the world because, we still live with this idea, since the fall of communism and the Soviet Union, we live with the idea that Soviet communism was a huge failure. And of course, it was a huge failure. But, democratic socialism, social democracy, in particular in Western Nordic Europe, I think has been a very large success and with limitations in particular regarding North-South inequality, regarding environmental destruction, regarding lots of dimensions, but still we need to build on the successes of this experience to try to think about the next step. And I think one of the big failure of the left, since the 1980s, 1990s, has been to stop thinking about the sort of the next step and the next world and what kind of alternative socioeconomic system we want in the long run. And the social democracy is not a frozen product. It's not and many social democratic parties starting in the 1990s with Blair, Clinton, but also in France, in Germany, everywhere, but also in India, Congress, pretty much everywhere. I've sort of I've stopped thinking about the long run and the alternative economic system, and I've started to adopt a sort of relatively conservative or neoliberal views that, okay, we have built the welfare state, we should freeze now everything, we should just protect what has been done in the past and stop thinking about the next step. And by doing so, I think they have many, many members of the lower income groups and lower middle income groups, have felt completely abandoned by the left and have started, either to stop voting. Some of them, have been moving to nationalist parties who were proposing completely different narrative about what was going to improve their situation. I think very misleading narrative in the long run, but if the left is not proposing any narrative at all, this has been now. So that's part of the answer. Is we have to
Correct.
build new collective organization, collective labor movement with platform of socio-economic transformation. So I talk about uh, democratic participatory socialism. In some other countries, some other contexts, people may want to use other words, but to me, we have to be quite explicit about this. The biggest difficulty is probably the transnational and north-south dimension, which is absolutely critical, of course, and on which the labor movement historically has tried to push, of course, for an internationalist agenda, but with limited success and sometimes with a lot of hypocrisy. Uh, and so the question is, is this going to change? And I think the climate crisis sort of forces us to
Yeah.
be sort of more global, more transnational in the thinking, but we're still very far from it. And I think here, the question is, are Western countries, rich countries, are they gonna wait? Do they need for enormous environmental catastrophe, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa? Do they need for much more geopolitical pressure from the global south, from the BRIC country in particular? I don't know, but if they don't share the wealth, and I think at this stage we really need some kind of global wealth tax and global billionaire, which with redistribution of tax revenue towards the south, in proportion to population, in proportion to exposure to climate change. If we don't do something like that, I think the influence of China, Russia, also India, Brazil, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, is going to grow and grow. And when I hear Western countries, only talk about Ukraine and the defense of Israel and asking to the rest of the world, please support us in our defense of Ukraine, and completely forgetting about the enormous north-south inequalities, the enormous hypocrisy of the West with respect to their historical responsibility for climate change, and more generally the fact that the rise of the West would never have happened without the rest of the world and without a global system of exploitation of natural resources and also labor, human resources, in a very brutal manner, to say the least, for many centuries. And this historical legacy has to be confronted. There are solutions. When I was writing Capital in the 21st Century 10 years ago, and I was proposing, global wealth tax, most people, at least, mainstream economists and mainstream policy circles, were sort of laughing at me and saying, this will never happen. And, this year at the G20, we had a discussion about the global wealth tax, interestingly, which was not pushed by Europe or US, it was pushed by Brazil. And, I hope one day, when the government changes in India and, maybe, this will happen next time, it will also be pushed by India. And, I
Yeah.
think we need a strong, impetus, coming from the south and rather than have China and India rule the game, China and Russia rule the game. I would prefer to have India, Brazil push for a reform of the IMF, international economic system, international fiscal system. I think by and large, we are taking this route. I think this is what's going to happen. This might take a lot of time. This can take enormous geopolitical crises. All this transformation in the 20th century came under the pressure of the Soviet Union, came under the pressure of enormous financial crises. this transformation have never been simple, but they happened, and I think they can and should continue. And I think for this, when to me one of the big lessons for also for the youth and for everybody is we should not leave the study of economic and financial issues to economists. They belong to everybody. These are not, economists pretend that they have built a science that is so scientific that nobody else can understand. But of course, this is a joke. I mean, we know this. We are not in a, we are in the social sciences. We are not in quantum physics, where it's a, we should do sort of simple historical descriptive analysis, and everybody should try to make his or her own opinion about discussion about taxation, public debt, financial issue. And I think in the end, this is what can contribute the most to bring political change.
I think, this the economists sometimes talk like stock market managers using different difficult jargons to kind of make it difficult for people to access. We'll take two questions. We have interesting, but I think Amit Thorat, who is an economist at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, I mean, he was part of a Lancet commission along with his father, who was also an economist, on reparations. William Darity had put together that many years ago, but never saw the light of the day. But I think what he's saying is, I mean, you also write about this reparations in your book, and it's very interesting. And and I was very happy to see that you mentioned Thomas Paine, somebody who we are inspired by as well. About Thomas Paine, not only talking for agrarian justice, I mean, pre-Marx, pre all these revolutions, 18th century, not only in America, Britain, but also France, right? And the elites claimed compensation for the freedom of slaves. And Thomas Paine, on the other hand, was like, we got to pay them. These are the, but then, we also see simultaneous forces taking place, for example, on the Russian landscape, the serfdom, what we have, the classes of sages, merchants, and commoners, sort of, as more expansion of land takes, labor is kind of, supposed to be made more accessible. So in this sense, today, the symbolic land space is also gone into the territorial technologies of AI, and this expansive universe of metaverse and so forth. And also people like Musk's and other demagogues are hoping to colonize the kind of space. And I think it brings an interesting mix of question to think about what happened 200 years ago. In this case, France, for example, I mean, it's very interesting. World wars were fought not in America, on Europe, but America was still kind of equal participant. And I think there is a way that not just unions and social democratic parties, but also I strongly think the nationalism of some sort helped foment a kind of a socialist principle. And they were also conservatives and so forth. So we see this contradiction rising. What do you think of reparations in this case, not just like in generally, but what Amit is also saying is land distribution, income transfer via taxes, education grants till graduation, which is also something kind of advocated in this essence. So clearly, it's a democratic socialist impulse. The G20 is talking about it. How do we today, in contemporary context, look at the existing alternative universe of technology where labor as a human being is being replaced with a certain mechanical codes and algorithms, and yet it impacts our daily lives? So this kind of two set of questions: reparations in the sense of what happens, what is to do with it, and also the value of labor in the technological world. Yeah.
Okay, very big questions, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave after that because I have to run to another meeting here. But and I apologize really for that. Reparation, I think, I have in my book, in my brief history of equality, also in Capital in Ideology, I talk a lot about reparation. I talk a lot about the case of Haiti, which is sort of one of the most extreme case where, the French state until the 1950s, from between 1825 and the 1950s, was receiving payment from Haiti, from the poor state of Haiti, for compensation for the loss of slave property, when Haiti became independent. And all the French regime, whether you talk about the monarchy, the Second Empire, the Third Republic, the Fourth Republic, they kept getting the money from Haiti. And I think this is a clear example to me where we cannot just say, okay, this was a long time ago, we don't care. Because at the same time, we are ready to pay reparation for uh, spoliation that happened during World War II, World War One, even in some cases. So if you tell to people of Haiti, okay, you paid money to France, this is well documented until the 1950s, but this is too old, we don't want to hear about it, then it makes it very difficult to explain that you have some universal norms of justice and that you're treating everybody the same way. So we have to take seriously, not only for this example of Haiti, but more generally, claims about reparation. And the challenge at the same time is to provide answers which, take seriously all these specific claims and make specific proposal, design specific democratic deliberation, democratic procedure to find some right answer to that, but to put this answer into some universalist view of redistribution. So, when I was talking about redistribution of inheritance, minimal inheritance for everybody at age 25, this is for everybody. It's not whoever your ancestors are, whether your ancestors were slave owners or slaves, and so you need also to have this universalist perspective. And in the long run, of course, this is going to be the key component. But we need to have the two at the same time. We should not oppose these two logic. We should be very ambitious on both grounds at the same time. And is this easy? Do I have the complete answer? Of course not. It will take a lot of complex democratic fight and deliberation, a lot of misunderstanding with different sides accusing the other to care only about specific reparation or to care only about universalist redistribution. We have to combine the two. There's no other way. Now, for new space for private appropriation in digital land, I think you're perfectly right. I mean, we are heading for sort of a new form of enclosures, a new form of private appropriation of our own data, our own space, our own thinking, our own anything we write or think is being used by algorithm and artificial intelligence algorithm and is being privately appropriated by a small group of people with the help of the state power, as it has always been in history. So yeah, state power, state capacity in itself is not good or bad for equality inequality. It depends who controls the state. It's always been like that. And one example I like to mention and I stress in my book is that of Sweden, which used to be one of the most unequal country, in Europe and in the world until the early 20th century, with a incredibly unequal political system. Even corporations had the right to vote in a municipal election in Sweden until 1910 on the basis of the capital invested in the country. So you had several dozen municipalities where one individual, which could be one corporation in some cases, had more than 50% of voting rights, and so was a perfectly legal dictator. And this is something corporations would love to do, in poor countries today. And sometimes they find other ways to get the same outcome, but nobody dares asking for the same voting system that was actually in place in Sweden in 1910. And then what happened is that in 1932, the Social Democratic Party with the labor union mover took power of Sweden and put the state capacity of Sweden to the service of a completely different project with, registration of income and wealth was used not to distribute political power, but rather to make people pay progressive tax to finance a system of health, education, etc., which is not perfect, etc., but which was better than anything we had seen before. So, state capacity is really the prime battle for the future, and we should just have more collective power, more political imagination, more developed platform for state capacity transformation than the property owning classes, which have always had a lot of imagination, to justify their private appropriation, and which will continue to do so. And again, the only possible answer is to build even stronger mobilization capacity and transformation ability. Thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry that I really have to run, but thanks a lot, Suraj, for organizing this. And I hope to meet you in person one day, in wherever, in India, in Europe, in North America, whatever.
We'll make that happen. You have a great, excellent rest of the evening. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.